Welcome everyone to the second plenary session. As the president of this table is Mr. Cynthia Lange, the executive director of the Interreligious Forum of Americas. On this second panel, the role of the community when promoting religious freedom or beliefs. As panelists, we have Knox, Thames, Juan, Navarro, Floria, and Nazila, Ghanea, and Ibrahim, Salama. I will pass the floor to Miss Cynthia. She will introduce the participants and follow with the work.
Well, welcome to the second plenary session today. I've never started one at 6:30 at night. We have a group of world-renowned experts who will address the role of the international community in promoting freedom of religion and belief. We're grateful for their participation and look forward to their wisdom. Some of them, as you see, are joining via webcam, and I'm delighted to introduce them as they speak and then facilitate some discussion after their remarks. Religious freedom or freedom of conscience is critical to the health of a diverse society. It allows different faiths and beliefs to flourish and to live peaceably with each other. Freedom of religion and belief is an essential condition for a free society. It's the oldest of our internationally recognized fundamental rights. Historically, these rights were recognized within a community or a tribe or a nation. But 75 years ago, the international community came together to create a new worldwide standard for human rights. In response to the genocide and religicide of the Holocaust, the countries around the globe created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For the first time, there was a worldwide document recognizing rights that were not bound by national boundaries. It was a revolutionary concept in protecting people all over the world. All humanity was included. Among the human rights recognized was the right to freedom of religion. Today, 75 years later, we're still striving to extend these rights around the world so all mankind can enjoy those rights. You here are part of a significant worldwide movement to continue to seek these freedoms for everyone. It's complex, it's never ending. It can be discouraging at times, but it's also inspiring. You inspire me. It's beyond the ability of one person or any one organization. For us truly to have freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, it requires many actors on various levels in the international community to make the enjoyment of these rights a reality. That helps frame our discussion here today as the role of the international community is what we'll be talking about. It's a perfect transition to our panelists. And we'll start with our two panelists on webcam representing the United Nations, and then we'll move to our distinguished in-person panelists here. Each person will speak for a bit, and then at the end, we'll have some discussion among the panelists if we have time and some questions. So first, I'm going to turn to Ibrahim Salama, Chief of the Human Rights Treaties branch of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, distinguished participants. It's a great pleasure to be among you today. And I thought of just sharing a few remarks emanating from my personal experiences, which are a little bit revolving around the idea of, they call it an unusual regard on freedom of religion in context, in its larger context. What I like in the title of your workshop is that it really deals with the two aspects of the problem, the barriers and the bridges. And I think any remedy or any improvement in the situation of human rights at large and in enhancing freedom of religion's role in its larger context in particular starts by a precise diagnosis of what are the problems. So my thoughts will revolve around what's the essence of the problem, human rights at large, and zooming on freedom of religion. What are the obstacles and what are the bridges? And for me, the problem, and I would love if we can have a discussion on this diagnosis and to which extent it reflects the situations in Latin America as well or not. I think essentially we have an issue that human rights community does not address sufficiently, despite the intensity of this phenomena, which is the tensions between different rights at large. Part of the collateral damage of the expansion of the human rights mechanisms is that they deeply focus on their areas, and the full picture, in a way, get lost. The very foundational notion in Vienna Declaration and Program of Action of the indivisibility, interdependence, interrelatedness, and equal emphasis on human rights is actually challenged by realities, the political realities of rights, because rights are the gains of constituencies defending their own claims and gaining legitimacy by the public opinion and by the legislations. But then not each and every community is equally interested in all aspects of human rights, which is absolutely legitimate and normal. And in that sense, the first objective and stroke legal essence of the problem of the progressive development of human rights and the achievement of their objective is the tensions among rights. The same thing applies to the tensions between religions and beliefs on one hand and human rights on the other hand. The second source of the problems I submit for our collective consideration is political. The phenomena of instrumentalization of religions for political purpose, which is as old as history, as old as religions, as old as human communities. I'm always intrigued by the idea if human rights community managed to identify criteria for distinguishing offensive speech from inciting speech, the latter only being prohibited under Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Could we ever reach a point where we can define when is religion in the political discourse and action legitimate, and when is it instrumentalized in a manner that at least breaches the spirit of human rights and transforms religion from a right in itself into a tool to violate rights in a way? And then a third problem is more conceptual, and it's very much at the heart of the challenges I submit that human rights universality are facing now in many manifestations, which is the notion of the relationship of the different sources of values. There's a triangle between law, religions, and faith traditions at large, and morality or human values that are completely secular. And the articulation of the obvious complementarity between the three elements, in fact, has never taken place sufficiently. I feel that there is an unfinished business of human rights universality because it didn't articulate sufficiently the tensions and complementarities with the other two sets of values, culture and religion. What are the obstacles? In my view, framing freedom of religion only as one separate right and not as a whole source of values is a problem. Doctrinal secularism is another problem, and I will not elaborate on what this means, but we see manifestations on daily basis in different countries. And the missing of an adapted narrative that could convey and reconcile the freedom of religion with other human rights. The fact that many think that we also need freedom from religion as much as freedom of religion is very telling to the fact that the tensions between values is an issue on which we haven't embarked sufficiently. Where are the bridges or the potential bridges? The pointers I have in mind is that I think that faith actors need to be more acting as one large community that corresponds to the definition of human rights law to religion or belief as any type of beliefs and not only the traditional sense of monotheistic main religions. The fact that humanistic values and even atheism is a protected belief as much as any established religion in the common sense require the community of believers in all sets of values to have a space to discuss these issues and to articulate the tensions, respect the tensions whenever they exist, and they do not constitute a violation of human rights, of course, because the catch-22 of the Vienna Declaration of the Program of Action in its Article 10, when it speaks about the importance of respecting religious and cultural particularities, and then at the end of the same paragraph, that these particularities should not be used as a disclaimer or as a waiver for human rights. I think also another potential bridge is to discover and unpack and promote the role of human rights actors, of religious actors and faith actors at large, as their own role and their responsibilities in the area of human rights. A third element is the issue of mutual literacy and the need to open up the angle of vision of faith actors, so that instead of defending their own individual communities and believers, they stand up for all communities, all religious communities, and all human rights, not only the freedom of religion. And the fourth element is the issue of education, to which extent religious education can integrate human rights, and to which extent human rights studies need to better understand religion. So this mutual illiteracy that makes religions and human rights like ships passing in the night, which of course enhances the chances of hitting an iceberg of misunderstandings that are hidden under the waters. Finally, to say that the recent crises, like the burning of Quran and other tensions, show that despite the progressive development and clarification through many documents, including the Rabat Plan of Action and the Faithful Rights Framework, despite all of this, there remains a big question mark. Even if the law is clear, does this in itself resolve the problems on the ground? And if the answer is, I would submit, obviously not. Law has never been enough to guarantee social cohesions and equal respect in societies between different communities. Then what is missing and how to reach what is missing? Those are the preliminary thoughts and questions, and I would leave it at that stage. Thank you very much.
Wonderful thoughts. Thank you. Gives us a lot to talk about. Nazila, we'll go to you, please. We'd love to hear.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Cynthia Lange, co-panelist, Dr. Salama, Knox, Thames, Professor Floria. Pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry that I'm not there in Brasilia with you in person, but glad to be joining you, and thank you for the invitation. I think my thoughts will go very much along the lines of what Dr. Salama has shared, but maybe just approaching it in a slightly different way. I just wanted us to start with where we have agreement in international human rights law. The freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief remains misunderstood or misused, but this is not because of the lack of understanding or development over the last 75 years as to its contours. So I think we find that we are myth busting a lot of the time and recapturing the agreed grounds repeatedly. But let's just touch upon the parameters that have been agreed in international human rights instruments. We appreciate that freedom of religion or belief cannot ever be legitimately derogated from, even in times of public emergency that threaten the life of the nation. That's captured in Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which 167 states, or 87% of the states of the world, have ratified and are bound by. As far as I know, there's no derogation to that, but we know that Article 18 cannot be derogated from. We also have the understanding that religion or belief, or thought, conscience, and religion, is to be construed broadly and include theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs. The UN Human Rights Committee that oversees that same covenant clarifies that. They also emphasize that freedom of religion or belief protects traditional and non-traditional religions or beliefs, including indigenous spiritualities, and necessarily also protects interpretation and diversity of human thought. The internal aspect of freedom of religion or belief, or the right to have, adopt, and change religion or belief, is absolute. There cannot be any coercion to inhibit this ability, at least not legally. And then there is also the right to individually or collectively to manifest religion or belief in worship, observance, teaching, and practice that is just illustrative of a scope that is detailed more in Article 6 of the 1981 UN Declaration: charitable giving, service activities, education of children, promotion of religion or belief, fundraising, appointment of leaders or representatives, etc. All of those are included under freedom of religion or belief. These that are all called manifestation are not absolute. They can be subject to limitation, so long as that is provided by law, non-discriminatory, and necessary in pursuit of an exhausted list of legitimate grounds, which includes respect for the rights and freedoms of others. It does not include national security, nor the list of grounds on which this freedom is so often obliterated around the world. Freedom of religion or belief, as we all appreciate, overlaps with a broad set of other rights, the most obvious ones being non-discrimination and equality, freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, perhaps the right to education and other socioeconomic rights, etc. So the fundamental principles that can guide us in realizing the contours of freedom of religion or belief are, as Dr. Salama reminded us, an appreciation of the indivisibility, the interdependence, interrelatedness of all human rights. And secondly, that freedom of religion or belief protects individuals, either individually or collectively, and their rights and their ability to be able to live lives free of violence, discrimination, and coercion. The duty of states, therefore, is to create an enabling environment in which all these, this pluralism, this diversity can flourish, can be enjoyed, and agency and the ability to exercise all human rights are enabled. And the dignity and equality of all rights holders be upheld. So why do we have so many challenges? Well, this right is unfortunately violated all too readily all around the world. All these points that we have just made about what has been crystallized regarding freedom of religion or belief in international human rights instruments remains unrealized in most parts of the world for most people. We need to better understand how prejudice, hate, and violations of freedom of religion or belief interact with one another. Where does the hate stem from the prejudice and drive the violations against the enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief? We need to better make the violations visible. Most of them remain invisible, the ways they feed one another, the ways they interact, and the way the rights that prejudice and discrimination, let's say in policy and law, the way it burdens rights holders from enjoying daily life, let alone the full realization of freedom of religion or belief. How that discrimination can be crushing for rights holders. And as well as better distinguishing and appreciating and seeing the violations, we need to better distinguish and observe the violators and better respond to them. Now, intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief has been defined, for example, in the 1981 UN Declaration on Intolerance and Discrimination based on religion or belief. In Article 2, it captures that no one should be subject to discrimination by any state, institution, group of persons, or person on grounds of religion or belief. Now, this is obvious, that obviously discrimination can stem from the state. The state has special responsibilities and obligations in international human rights law, but is not the only violator, and others also have responsibilities, even if in the law we don't call them obligations. So institutions, group of persons or persons discriminate and violate the rights and freedoms of others. But the state cannot hide behind the violations that stem from institutions and groups of persons. The state has the responsibility to create the enabling environment. It has due diligence, that it must be responsible. The police cannot stand by whilst a place of worship is being attacked or persons are being attacked. So when we see the violators, we acknowledge that there are other violators, but the state's responsibilities remain very serious and its obligations remain. Article 2 carries on and says that for the purposes of this declaration, intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief means, what does it mean? It means any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on religion or belief, having as its purpose or its effect nullification or impairment of the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis. Now, we could read this and it's very familiar language, but let's think about it. Any distinction, any exclusion, any restriction, or any preference for anybody on grounds of their religion or belief, theistic, non-theistic, or atheistic, indigenous spiritualities, majority religion, traditional religion, minority religion, new religion, no distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference. How often is that realized? It doesn't matter if it wasn't the purpose, it wasn't intentional exclusion. Unintentional exclusion is also a violation of freedom of religion or belief. It's the effect that we are concerned about. These fundamental freedoms are to be enjoyed on an equal basis. Now, the international community has as its tools for promoting freedom of religion or belief. In the mandate, it has the tools of reporting, of communications, of country missions, and more reporting, and engagement. At the international, beyond the mandate, which is, after all, an independent capacity, in the United Nations, there are the reporting obligations of states to the UN Human Rights Committee, to Universal Periodic Review, and to the possibility of civil society, non-government organizations, and others to engage with these processes. But I think we remain a long way from the understanding, let's say, of other prejudices, discriminations, and intolerances. With racism, we have understood the distinction between race and racism. UNESCO established that for us decades ago, some 50 years ago. With religion or belief, we are still confused between religion or belief, state religion, institutions of religion or belief, and persons or groups whose prejudices are fueling the continuity of these hatreds and violations. Yet the common grounds are many. We need to find our common grounds and then use that as the basis for stronger efforts in promoting freedom of religion or belief. Our tools need sharpening, and they need to be used in concert with one another. Our actors, there are many actors in freedom of religion or belief. I sketched just the surface of that in the Human Rights Council report back in March. And the actors are many. In the report to the UN General Assembly in October, I highlight those at the subnational level, that we can look at the prosecutors around the world, the national human rights institutions, the mayors, the local municipalities and actors, the actors who could play a positive role and who indeed also infringe freedom of religion or belief are multiple, even at the subnational level. We need to still better understand this right, and for the different actors with obligations and responsibilities to not hide behind one another. We need to make the invisible violations more visible and better appreciated by the human rights community. Perhaps I've raised a lot more questions than answered them, but my sincere thanks for listening, and I look forward to our interactions.
Well, thank you. Let's move on and hear some more from our panel. Let's move to Professor Juan Navarro Floria. He's professor of law at the Pontifícia Universidad Católica de Argentina. He's a member of the Latin American Consortium for Religious Freedom of the Internet and of the International Consortium for Law and Religion Studies. Professor.
Thank you very much.
I will speak English. And first, I will thank you. If I were to speak in Portuguese, it would be a disaster. I will try to speak slowly so you can comprehend me. I would like to thank you so much for the invitation to be here participating in this wonderful symposium. I would like to congratulate Rodrigo Agari for the organization. And we are really enjoying this every day. And I will start speaking about the theme where you invited me, the role of the international community in international faith and beliefs freedom. This is very important, and we have been talking about it. The other panelists have mentioned it. And the first question that we have is what we understand as international community. For some is very evident, for others it cannot be as so. First, international community we have as the states, of course, this is clear, but the countries, but other international players. And we have the perspective of human rights, which are individual rights. If you think about, we have human rights for 150 years, and this was for state representatives. Now, each and every one of us have rights that are valid in international community. And we also have the organizations, the international organizations, which are also important players in this game. And in this moment, we could remember the content of religious freedom as acknowledged for international treaties for human rights, as we also mentioned earlier. And we describe those contents. We can see that religious freedom has an individual dimension and also a collective dimension. And in this collective dimension, this exercise of religious freedom has an incredible role for the international communities, for the religious communities. The religious communities have a local presence because there's a person that lives in a certain place, but many times it has a dimension that is in a global or international. They are present worldwide, or at least in a good part of the world. This way, the churches and the international communities are also important players in the international setup. And something significant is all of the churches, the international communities, in some place in the world with some time, they have been or they are majorly dominant, official religions of a country. In other places, in other countries, there are minorities. Some are very small, and some are chaste. Its members in places where they're not dominants can be chased, and its international freedom might be compromised. That's why some people might have not experienced. Some people might have experienced religious persecution, for example, and we can know from other brothers of ours that might have had this experience. So the churches in the international religious communities have to advocate for religious freedom, not their own only, but everyone's. And they must be conscious of the international dimension or the global dimension of the problems that religious freedom is face, obligating communities to review old doctrines where they thought it were the only one, or trying to be the only religious presence in the world. They might be able to accomplish that for a while, they might have done, but now this won't happen, or it shouldn't happen, because it is an excluding presence. So the religious gathering and the good convivence of our religions is mandatory. I'm a Catholic, and I can acknowledge the privilege that the Catholic Church has. They are acknowledged as a subject of international law. And we have some actors that are recognized. And the Holy See is acknowledged, and they participate actively in the discussions of the international community. But they don't do that to claim for privilege of Catholics. I don't know, before, but not now. Because the Holy Seat, when they intervenes, they do asking for the international freedom for all, without exception. And they do that because in their own doctrine, they're asking for the irrestricted respect of religious freedom as a human rights, just as others, interrelated. And those rights are a demand for dignity of human people. We all have received today the Declaration of Punta del Este of human dignity, and it has a crucial concept. This declaration is an exercise, an interesting exercise that a group of scholars have done. I had the privilege of writing this with a group. It was an interesting discussion with various geographies, ideas, ideologies, and we all agreed in this text. This is a declaration that invites us, and it should be it should have a more broad validity. It is for men and women, and we all have been created by God in image and resemblance, and this concept of human dignity does not depend on faith or belief. It is a comprehension, is accessible for all people, and that's what we have tried to state. Of course, this is very diverse. We have different beliefs, we have different reasons of faith. We have reasons that will go further than religious faith. Other confessions from the Holy Seat do not have a international legal person that will acknowledge it. But they can also be heard in the international forums. And I want to say that this voice will be listened, valued, and served if we can do it together. If you are underlying the coincidences that you have and not the differences. It is a challenge for the religious community. It is a challenge that will represent the diverse form of internal articulation, organization, the existence or non-existence of authority representing. This is a theme we know exists generically, but they could accomplish a common voice as and this could be more potent than the ones that can do individually. And this is needed, that this voice is heard, because we have other voices in the community that are more hostile. Some are worse than others. There is a big movement of voices in the international community, and it could be possible to eliminate. There was something that was graceful, but not, I don't think it was too much. They say religion is opium for people. I can say it's not the opium, but it's like tobacco. But smoking is terrible today. And if you start smoking, we're going to ask you to leave because you cannot smoke in front of other people. So sometimes it's kind of like this. It's something has somebody that has the bad habit of smoking or praying, for example. This is the view that sometimes even the means of communication can broadcast that, and the religious community has the challenge to contrast with another point of view. But the religious communities also have a responsibility in defending, promoting, and fomenting the religious freedom, not just for the persons that act to that, where the state can ensure that this is not affected, and we have seen the human treaties in regional levels. For example, like in Costa Rica, the Convention of Human Rights, we have the supervision, and we have the religious freedom agreement. What I believe we can ask, and I don't know if this is enough as it is, and I don't know, because the religious freedom is one of the most vulnerable rights, and we could not remember that for international studies. It's the amount of countries where the religious freedom is not respected. And we see many communities having their religious freedom violated. So a person with institutions like the one I am presiding, like the Argentinian Council for international religious freedom, or the work that is being done here and work we're doing with the international community, we have to elaborate an international convention dedicated to the protection of religious freedom. We have tried to do that. As a fruit of this work, we have the declaration in 1981, as Nazila remembered, is a declaration. It's not mandatory for states, but we would think that it would be worth to try to articulate that. We had difficulties for the agreement. Some of the difficulties disappeared, some arose, but in the last few decades, we felt the need to have major protection for religious freedom. And as we see the importance of religion, including international conflicts, situations that happen in the world, and religion won't disappear, will still be important for all people. It would be important to think at a global level and also as a regional level in Americas, other continents might think about their own, to have a declaration of religious freedom, to have a treaty for the states that can be applied in international courts. It can be a binding agreement for international courts. And the international community can comply. We can add to that. And the education for the living within religious groups, the people with different religious views. If we have the international treaties, the education can promote the peace. They can promote the coexistence of different religions. But for that to be possible, we need to promote education for children and youth, for the life and the people of the community, so we can have appropriate knowledge without distortion of the distinct religions. We cannot enjoy, we cannot like somebody we don't know. We have to understand, we have to believe, because the dimension of life is very important for the majority of people who live in this world. And in this world, it might seem that international organisms, some levels of government, some levels of countries, we have an underrepresentation of religious belief. Some public workers, government workers, they have a shorter religious living than the people who live in the country they represent. And something important is education. States cannot just they don't have to just teach religion, but this has to be done by communities, families. But there should be a way of teaching that. This is a very delicate subject, but it's important that states can promote the means for the families to provide religious education. So we have the Pact 18.4, for example, the right of the priests to have education complying with their educational background. And we have to allow mutual knowledge, fomenting mutual admiration. This is something to be done with the states and the religious commissions to be done, to be able to enable that. I remember, for example, Toledo's principles. How many years for the development of this we had to formulate. I wanted to connect the ideas. It seems very important. And we have to share, to think of concrete things to do to protect more the religious freedom. It would be also a work that is done in local communities with political leaders, with the countries, because the international community is the results of the gathering of all countries' representatives. All countries send a representative, and for that, internal work is needed with the representatives of the countries to see the importance of this. And lastly, I would say it seems like an example that is very interesting, an example of interaction with politics, the states, academy, the civil society. In the last few years regarding G20, this is a small expression of the international community, because the countries are, well, a small part of the population of the world. A biggest part of the global economy has we need a purpose, an economical and financial purpose, and we have other issues. And I don't know for how many years we have this interfaith forum that some have participated, and that is seeking for that, to making the voices of the communities to reach the leaders of the world so they can represent that voice. And at the end of the day, to represent all the ones that live in this planet. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Okay, last but not least, Knox Thames is a senior fellow at Pepperdine University and a senior visiting expert with the United States Institute for Peace. Has many years of experience in this area, and we look forward to hearing from him.
We've all grappled in recent years with the COVID pandemic, but there's another pandemic that's sweeping the globe, a pandemic of religious persecution. Christians of all denominations face repression because of their beliefs, while other faith communities and those holding no beliefs also suffer. As I write about in my forthcoming book, persecution comes in a variety of forms, from authoritarian governments, democracies, extremists, and terrorists. Persecution does not respect borders and impacts all belief groups everywhere. The reality of religious persecution for so many exists in spite of efforts to protect religious freedom. 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the 25th anniversary of the International Religious Freedom Act from the United States, and the 10th anniversary of the European Union's guidelines on freedom of religion or belief. Yet despite these important documents, repression on account of religion or belief continues. Consequently, countries valuing freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief are at an inflection point. How much do we value our values? How should we respond? I think it's not so much an issue of legal standards, but rather an issue of countries working together to promote those standards and pressing countries that violate them to reform. So we need more countries involved. We need a diversity of voices. In my presentation tonight, we'll argue that Brazil is a needed player. Brazil has an opportunity to play a unique and needed role, one in line with its values and its traditional foreign policy, to help meet this global challenge. But before going on, I do want to thank the organizers for this wonderful conference. I want to thank Cole and Gary and Rodrigo just for organizing this, as well as your teams for making sure all the logistics happen. And it's, of course, a great honor to be a part of this panel with these distinguished colleagues. But why Brazil? Why should Brazil become involved more heavily in promoting religious freedom? Well, firstly, it's South America's largest country by population, landmass, and economic strength. So Brazil has the resources, expertise, and political significance to be a force for good, not only in the region, but the world. And considering how religious freedom is a shared value across the Americas, both North and South, it presents an opportunity to unite our hemisphere in an effort to encourage respect for freedom of religion or belief outside our region. Brazil, alongside with the United States, Canada, and other Western Hemisphere nations, could re-energize efforts to rescue the persecuted, speak out for the oppressed, and see laws changed. Brazil's religious and ethnic diversity is a strength, much like in the United States. According to the Datafolha survey, 50% of the population identifies as Roman Catholic, about 30% as evangelical, 11% as atheists or with no religion, and 5% as Afro-Brazilian or spiritualists, in addition to communities of Muslims and Jews. This diversity is a true strength. And that's not to say Brazil, your country, or the United States, my country, we're perfect. We're not. We have much to continue to live up to our founding ideals and to defend religious minorities. But we have diverse communities that generally coexist in peace. Brazil has a firm legal foundation. Brazil's constitution protects religious freedom, declaring, quote, freedom of conscience and of belief is inviolable. The free exercise of religious cults being ensured and, under the terms of the law, the protection of places of worship and their rights being guaranteed. It also declares, no one shall be deprived of any rights by reason of religious belief or philosophical or political conviction, end quote. With Lula now returned to the presidency, he has worked to craft a middle way diplomacy. While condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, his administration has emphasized dialogue between the two belligerents, wanting to avoid a new Cold War. As the president's foreign policy advisor recently said in the Financial Times, the Brazilian administration believes the West must take into account Putin's security concerns, something that the Biden administration, NATO allies, and the Ukrainians themselves would disagree with. However, Brazil is returning to its own approach, one that looks very similar to what Pope Francis has promoted. Yet the Lula administration, favoring a route of dialogue, positions it for tremendous influence if it chooses to use that influence. While human rights activists always hope for more, Lula's non-aligned status as a rights-respecting liberal democracy can have impact. Lula indicated he would press Nicaragua's Ortega to release Bishop Rolando Alvarez, personally lobbying for his freedom. Considering Brazil's close ties with Nicaragua, such an intervention is only possible by the president in a way that's unavailable to either the Holy See or the United States. And I've witnessed over the years similar work when Brazil engaged Iran for the release of pastors and raised concerns with North Korea about their repressive system. In addition, Brazil's involvement has strengthened international religious freedom advocacy efforts. Brazil, of course, is known for supporting multilateral diplomacy, favoring work through the United Nations and the Organization of American States. In continuation of this, Brazil has played a key leadership role in setting up and guiding the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. And domestically, I know Brazilian Baptists and others have been working with the Foreign Ministry to help resettle religious minorities from Afghanistan fleeing the Taliban. But over my 20-year career as a civil servant with the U.S. government, in addition to having served in both the Obama and Trump administrations at the State Department, I know the challenge of keeping priorities consistent between very different leaders. It's hard to protect the work of promoting religious freedom from partisan influences. And living in the Washington, D.C. area, the events of January 6th at home were shocking, like the events of January 8th were here. However, political turmoil and disagreement should not distract from core values in international affairs. Allowing ourselves to be pulled away limits influence and frankly leaves millions facing persecution without friends, allies, or advocates. Of course, there will always be a temptation in politics to mix domestic debates about religious liberty with the work of combating religious persecution abroad. This is true here and in the United States. Concerned about this dynamic in my own country, I co-authored a report for the United States Institute of Peace with recommendations to protect the international work from partisanship by emphasizing the situation is often so much more severe internationally, often life and death. Here in Brazil, while some criticize the previous government's use of religion for political ends, Brazil's global partners welcomed its forward-leaning efforts to promote international religious freedom. I saw firsthand how experienced Brazilian diplomats steered Brazil away from an overly political or ideological approach. They promoted religious freedom holistically as a universal human right in a way that built off Brazil's unique international standing as a leading global South nation. I mean, the religious freedom movement needs Brazil's engagement. Brazil hosting the G20 Interfaith meeting next year is an encouraging thought. One, I hope they will take up energetically and integrate with their other G20 priorities. Regarding international meetings on human rights and religious freedom, to date, all the summits have either been convened in the United States or Europe. The Czech Republic will hold the next Religious Freedom Ministerial in November, which I very much appreciate their leadership. However, having South America's leading nation host an international religious freedom ministerial would bring important geographic diversity while providing the Lula administration a tangible way to show its commitment to the issue. In addition, having a center-left government convene the global meeting would reinforce political diversity and demonstrate how religious freedom matters across the political ideological spectrum. Now, during my diplomatic service for the United States, I oversaw the 2 religious freedom summits in Washington, and they are significant undertakings. So if it's infeasible to host an international meeting here in Brasilia with the G20 coming up, Brazil could convene a regional discussion about how to jointly promote our shared values of religious freedom, which could still have tremendous impact. Such a conversation could occur here or in one of the other great cities in Brazil, or at the Organization of American States headquarters, or at the annual OAS General Assembly, looking for ways to promote the right or to defend the rights of religious minorities. In conclusion, Brazil will conduct its diplomacy differently from the United States. We don't need Brazil to copy the US human rights advocacy approach, but we do need Brazil to join hands in this effort to combat extreme persecution on account of faith. Brazil wields considerable diplomatic, economic, and political weight. The international community would welcome Brazil's partnership, and millions of persecuted women and men, and many children from all faiths and none, need our help collectively. Thank you.
I have so many questions. In the few minutes we have remaining, let me pose a question and if you'd like to pose questions to each other, please feel free. But I want, if we want to further the goals of religious freedom for all, I appreciate you all talking about how important it is to recognize the rights of others, including the right to not believe. It's not just about furthering our interests. So what can we, our respective organizations, do to make progress on promoting tolerance and human dignity for all? That's a broad question. Feel free to give a short or focused answer. And Ibrahim, I see you looking for the mute button. Maybe you wanted to start first.
If you would like to follow the same order, I would say that in my organization, what we are trying to do lately for furthering better respect for freedom of religion and also transforming that human rights from a suspicious right into a fully integrated right is a collective effort that we have been conducting with the special procedure system and with the treaty bodies, which was to articulate the faithful rights framework based on all the previous attempts to try to reconcile freedom of religion with other human rights. So this framework adopted in 2017, and Naz was one of the founders of this framework, and she chaired with Ahmed Shahid at that time in Beirut, I remember, the main 2 working groups of the drafting of the declaration. and the commitments themselves. So we hope that this, and also in collaboration with institutions like United States Institute for Peace, and Knox referred to his work there, we also transformed this framework from merely a set of soft law standards into a methodology of peer-to-peer learning through an online self-paced course on freedom of religion and its linkages to other human rights. So I think if I have only three keywords, they will be education, education, and education in this field, because as Nazila mentioned, the weight of perceptions and stereotypes and prejudices when it comes to religion are, for some reason that I ignore, even heavier than on other grounds of discrimination, probably because of the history of religion in international relations and in national tensions. But we hope that this creates a new direction where a common narrative based on the what I call the double convergence, what's common between all faith traditions, because the idea is not to defend your own faith tradition, because otherwise you fall into the trap of fragmentation. The idea is that everybody stands for all human rights for all, including in the case of form, every religious community defends the rights of all other religious communities and the rights of non-believers as such on equal basis, because this is a protected belief. Over to you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Please, yeah. Knox, can you put the microphone right in front of you, apparently?
I would just add a thought about, I've often talked about how effective religious freedom advocacy it stands tallest off a four-legged advocacy stool. And if any of these legs are not as strong or wobbly, then advocacy won't be as durable or successful. And the four legs are governments, elected leaders like parliamentarians, civil society, and religious leaders, all raising their collective voices to advocate for freedom of belief for everyone. And when I say governments, I also include the United Nations, the different international organizations, but each of those have a specific area of influence. Each of those have a different voice that carries in different ways. And if all four are in unison about the importance of religious freedom for everyone, both their own nationals or their own community, as well as those outside of their communities, that's going to be the surest way to see the lasting results that our world so needs.
I agree. No, I fully agree with what Ibrahim and Knox said. And I underline the importance of education. Education in the religious communities, and education in the full society by the state.
You answered one of the questions I had. Educate whom? We educate ourselves and we educate others. So both. We don't just educate others. We also educate ourselves. I appreciate understanding that. And also, and Nazila, you haven't had a chance, maybe, as you're thinking about it, what can people in this room take away too? And maybe this is good, I think people are thinking, but if there's anything else you want to add to that, Nazila?
Thank you. I agree with my co-panelists. I think the golden rule is a very good place to start. Don't do unto others what you don't wish done unto you, or if we reverse it, do unto others what you wish done unto you. I agree that regarding education and the four legs of the stool that Knox was talking about, we also need to put ourselves in the shoes of others, or see religion or belief from their perspective. We might not appreciate what this holy book means to somebody. We may not appreciate that the mountain is sacred. We may not appreciate that, how a community might organize if it doesn't have clergy, how it organizes. We might not appreciate that the funeral has to be held in the way that religion or belief community holds dear. And I was just at the Congress, the Humanists Congress. And, you know, they were talking about hope and resilience and the need to support others. So, you know, our commonalities are many. We need to appreciate what is held dearly in terms of thought, conscience, and belief for others. And this is not incompatible with wishing to promote a particular religion or belief. At the Congress, they were also talking a lot about youth and sharing humanist values and persuading others into humanism. So, you know, respecting the freedom of religion or belief of others with sincerity and robustly is not incompatible with holding a truth claim, coming to a certain conclusion about faith at this moment at least, and being able to coexist peacefully and respectfully with others.
Thank you. Well, we have 3 minutes left, and I told you you could each have 1 minute to end. If you can really keep it to 1 minute, I think we can go. Knox, I'm going to let you start.
Just to add a point on education, completely agree on the need to educate youth about how to live together in diversity to help combat the mentality that leads to persecution. But there's another type of education we can't forget, the education of teaching communities about what activities are permissible through law enforcement. If the police don't enforce the laws to hold people accountable, communities are learning lessons, the wrong lessons, and it leads to a climate of impunity. So jail time can also be an instructor, and we can't forget about the importance of law enforcement.
And there are another subject for education, the media, the journalists. We need to educate the journalists and the media because the image of the religion in the media is not real. There are not fair play there, and we need to work with this.
Excellent point. Okay, Nazila? You're on mute.
Okay, I couldn't unmute. Now I can unmute. I think the international community, all of us, have gone some way to at least understanding discrimination, intolerance, and violations on the grounds of race, against women, against children. And I think we have to all dig deeper to understand the forms that intolerance and discrimination on grounds of religion or belief takes, and more robustly organize in order to address it.
Yeah. Ibrahim, you get the last word. Oh, no. You're good.
Thank you very much. I think a forum would be my last word. Why do we have a social forum? Why do we have a forum of minorities? Why do we have a forum of indigenous people and not forum on factors and actors of religion? Why religion is always on the defensive and not contributing to the solution? Why only part of the problem and not of the solution? A forum would be my last word. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, panelists, so much for this engaging discussion.